Hi, welcome back to Odyssey Astrology. I had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine, an old friend of mine, the other day, who knows that I practice meditation and different spiritual disciplines. And he asked me if in meditation what I was trying to do was, I forget exactly how he said it, but something along the lines of um, go beyond the ego or leave the ego. I think he said to leave the ego. And it was such an interesting question because I suppose in meditation philosophy, that is the idea of meditation, is that we leave behind our ego. And the ego to me is our attachment and identification with the body, our physical body, our mental body, and our emotional body. Most obviously with the physical body, but it's just as valid to say the ego is attachment and identification with the mental and emotional body. Because those joys, those pains, those traumas, the unhealed pain that we have keeps us tied to negativity, let's say. Um, and the positive feelings we have also keep us tied to certain things, certain facets of our being, certain things in our life, people, things, places. And so when we overcome and neutralize the feeling and attachments and fears that we have that connect us to our physical, mental, and emotional body, then we become all that is left, which is the spirit or the soul. And what that is, I suppose, opens up a whole nother conversation, but everyone seems to have a pretty good idea or an understanding, a personal understanding of what that is to them. But so when he asked me if in meditation I'm trying to leave the ego, my answer kind of surprised me because I said, no, I'm trying to go into it because it's composed of pain and I want to go into the pain so deeply that I'm free of it. It's like you have to pass through the fear to be free of the fear. You have to pass through the pain, the guilt, the sorrow, the grief, the anger to be free of it. If we try to leave it behind, oftentimes what it results in is that we're avoiding it. We're avoiding the negative facets of our being. And then that actually empowers those negative parts of ourselves even more in our life. And it determines who we draw into our life, the experiences we have in our life, and it perpetuates this cycle of suffering that we're trying to not escape from, but be free of. And I think that's the key word, is it's not escape. The more I live my spiritual path and the more I live life, the more I realize that escapism doesn't get us anywhere. And too often that's what spirituality turns into. And we see it all the time with the New Age spiritual movement. We see escapism. People, the most obvious form is when people start spiritualizing drug use and marijuana use, especially. You see all the time. People talk about the benefits of it and this and that. And even in India, because I've lived in India, I can say it's not just a phenomenon here. It's also in India. There's a lot of yogis and sort of wandering sadhus who smoke a lot of weed, and whether or not it helps them, I don't know. I tend to think it's just an escape from our real psychological and spiritual work. And so I think that's where the idea of being a yogi and being a spiritual seeker as a warrior comes into play. Because, like, for example, if you look at the great Hindu scriptures on the epics, the poems, they're sort of the equivalent of Homer, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. But in India, they have the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and they're spiritual epics. They're a lot like Homer, but they're more spiritualized. They're more obviously spiritual. I think Homer is deeply spiritual, and that's why I call my astrology practice Odyssey astrology. It's named after the Odyssey of Homer, or inspired by that at least. But in India, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, they're more obviously spiritual, and they're full of spiritual teachings. But they're both set in a battle, especially the Mahabharata. I mean, the climax of the whole saga is a battle between good and evil, between our and a lot of the interpretation of it, like Yogananda's interpretation of the Mahabharata, was that each character is a personification of a psycho-spiritual quality. So greed, material attachment, self-transcendence, all of these habits, the power of vitality, self-discipline, all of these qualities which come into play on the spiritual battlefield are personified in this epic, in the Mahabharata. And so the idea of spirituality is war, as of yoga as war is so fascinating, and I think it's really useful. And in our society, spirituality has become so pacifist, politically certainly. New Age spiritual people are very sort of pacifist and left wing, but and that's a totally separate issue. I don't mean to get into that, but what I mean is the real spiritual struggle is anything but pacifist, and we have to go to war against our own negative psycho-spiritual and emotional qualities, and we have to go into that pain. And so when he asked me this question about the ego, I realized all of the other, or many of the other questions and opinions, confusions about spirituality hinge on that, on are we escaping from the ego or are we going into the ego? That is to say, not to become more identified with it, but to go to the root of it. The root of what is tethering us to the ego is trauma and pain and grief and anger and negative emotions. And even the unhealthy attachments we have to other people, at the root of it is fear of them. And so if you go into the fear, if you go into all the way to the root of the ego, you are going to the eye of the storm. And in the eye of the storm, you can find the power to direct the storm and to ultimately calm the storm. And I think that is one of the main points that we're missing in this spiritual renaissance that we're seeing in the West and all around the world, because we have this idea of Asia and India as being more spiritually advanced than us. And historically, I think that's true in that they have a stronger heritage and practice of self-cultivation through spiritual exercises like meditation. And as an aside, that is in no way contradicting or opposing Christianity in any way. And meditation can simply be a exercise in communing more deeply with Christ, for example, or with any of the Christian saints. It can be seen as an exercise in praying more deeply and directly and fervently to God the Father. Meditation is in itself not beholden or a part of any one religion. It's a universal spiritual practice that can be used for anything. It's a way of concentration. And with that concentration, you can accomplish all kinds of things. It can be used for material gains. It can be used to, like I was saying, pray to Christ. So it's not actually a Hindu practice, it's a human practice, and it's in its core just simply breath work and concentration and controlling the body's energetic currents. And so in that, in a meditative state, I suppose we are rising above our ego. It's not an escape from it, or if it is, it's a temporary escape. But then oftentimes when we do that, we're also dredging up the heavy emotional and psychological baggage we have. And so really when we practice meditation deeply, it can make the other aspects of life more challenging because it's forcing us into a confrontation with our own demons, let's say. And by demons, we could think of them as our tendency towards anger, towards lust, greed, any of these things. So spirituality is war. And spirituality, I think, is going to the core of the pain that is the root of our ego. And when we see ego simply as unhealed pain, I think everything makes a lot more sense. And so that is the power of meditation. One of the powers of meditation is that it can take our mind and our emotions to the very core of what's creating suffering in our life, what's creating all the problems in our life, which of course have to do with the ego as well. But for myself and for other people, I encourage all of us to start seeing the ego in a new light and not running from it, not push it away, to contemplate it and to contemplate what is in ourself that is making our life heavy. What about us egotistically is driving the negative cycles in our life? And then to go into it rather than push it away.